buffer zones had the reputation of fewer tigers, lesser chances, and they were more considered as the backup option. As many of us know, is divided into two parts: a core and a buffer. Now, the core of forest, part of the forest, is strictly prohibited for any sort of human activity, particularly young males who are pushed out by dominant males, and younger tigresses looking to establish their own territory, disciplining of tourism. In fact, during the peak season, in many national parks, you can find 10, 15, 20, 25 vehicles together on a sighting. Good morning. A few years ago, if you told any serious wildlife photographer that the core is sold out and I might have to send you to the buffer, there's a good chance he might probably talk you out of it. And why not? Buffer zones had the reputation of fewer tigers, lesser chances, and they were more considered as the backup option if core permits were obviously sold out. But the reality is that perception is changing very fast. Today, the most exciting tiger safaris across India, and particularly places like Tadoba, are happening in the buffer. Forest departments are actively expanding buffer tourism. Conservationists are calling buffer zones as one of the most important tools of wildlife management. And that is one of the reasons why buffer zones are now picking up. So, what exactly is a buffer zone? And in today's video, I'll try to explain why buffer zones are important for conservation and for tourism. Let's talk about what a buffer actually is. Every tiger reserve in India, as many of us know, is divided into two parts: a core and a buffer. Now, the core of forest, part of the forest, is strictly prohibited for any sort of human activity. It is largely relevant for forest management, and the forest wildlife needs to be undisturbed. There is no human activity allowed of any sorts, be it plant gathering, be it using of forest products, or even allowing land for forest for cattle grazing. Nothing. This is what most people picture in or imagine when they go to a tiger reserve. Whereas the buffer zone is that part of the area which surrounds the core area. And if you really ask me, the rules here are not extremely strict. I would rather err on the side of saying less strict. And there's a reason, because they are surrounding the villages and farmlands and typically allow a mixed use of the forest landscape. So you are allowed to have cattle grazing in buffer forests, a part of it. You're also allowed to have wildlife lodges. So all the lodges that we work with or have kind of the rock recommendations that we give clients are all surrounding buffer forests. For decades, but buffer zones were seen as a secondary and necessary for protecting the core, but particularly not so much for wildlife. But in today's world, that assumption is really changing. And as we see, the sightings also of tigers in the buffer area are increasing. We may ask a question as to why the sightings in buffer areas are increasing. And this, to me, is the core reason. Tiger population in India over the last 15 years or so has been steadily increasing. And this is fantastic news for conservationists. But it also comes with its own set of spatial problems. Core zones have limited carrying capacity. By ballpark, if a forest is, say, X kilometers, square kilometers, the core is roughly about 35% of that, 30 to 35%. Remaining is all buffer. And there are only so many tigers that a core area can hold. An average tiger, depending on the prey species availability, etc., an average tiger occupies anywhere between 50 to 100 square kilometers, a male, whereas a female is between 20 to 25. And as the tiger number grows, particularly young males who are pushed out by dominant males, and younger tigresses looking to establish their own territory, they're increasingly forced to disperse outside their areas of core, and hence that's why management of the buffer becomes important. So, in a way, what you can see is that buffer zones are the areas surrounding the good stuff. They are actually becoming the good stuff. In all our interactions and all our sightings, I particularly am a big fan of Tadoba's buffers, and several buffer zones across places like Kanha, Bandhavgarh, Pench, and of course Tadoba are now host to resident breeding tigers. Some are iconic female tigers who are having litters after litters, and that is reducing the pressure on the core area to actually have that many number of cats. The second most important reason, if you ask me why buffers are important, is because of the pressure management. Just like tigers, there's also a limit about how many vehicles you can have in the tourism part of a core area, right? So if you are concentrating that many vehicles, it also puts a lot of pressure on the area in terms of disciplining of tourism. In fact, during the peak season, in many national parks, you can find 10, 15, 20, 25 vehicles together on a sighting. And that puts a lot of pressure on not only in terms of the eco-sensitivity of the area, but also on on the wildlife itself. You don't really want to disturb an animal, right? So animals are less stressed when their cars are dispersed. This also has another important effect. It is the release of economic value. When buffer zones are developed, it also gives chance to all the villagers to develop as guides, as naturalists, vehicle owners, lodges. All this come together to form an ecosystem to give that tourist who was not getting a core area ticket a very highly credible alternative which increases his safari experience. And believe me, I have been doing safaris for 25 years, and there, when you get inside that jungle, you do not understand the difference between a core and a buffer. It is purely in your mind and not in reality. As I mentioned, increasing number of tigers is a good thing, but they aren't really healthy if they are located on isolated islands. Genetic diversity requires this tiger gene pool to diversify into what we call other national parks through something that we call corridors. Buffer zones play an extremely important part in creating corridors. They, through villages, are connected to other reserves, and those other reserves then are connected to other reserves. Maintaining buffer zones becomes such a critical moment because these corridors, or rather the buffer areas which provide corridors, in fact, it's not only the tiger, in certain parts in northeast India, even in areas like Jharkhand, Bihar, those parts, Orissa, there are corridors through buffer forests which are huge enough to allow migration of elephants from one reserve to another. Of course, we have tigers also migrating through buffers and corridors, but protecting buffers becomes that much more important. And that is a single reason why today buffer forests are getting attention. Conservationists today are seeking enough of, are demanding, my bad, enough of attention as well as funding to promote buffer forests. Because if buffer forests did not exist, you will have a decaying gene pool of tigers dying because of death, and of course, even to an extent, predation by other tigers. So, for a healthy population of tigers and other animals, buffer forests become extremely important. Buffer zones are where wildlife and local communities share the landscape together. And this is making human wildlife conflict inevitable from livestock losses and crop damages. Tourism in these areas creates a powerful incentive for coexistence. Local people benefit through jobs, guides, drivers, lodges, and homestay hosts all get that economic perspective to maintaining a buffer. And that's why I mentioned there's an unlocking of economic value. Very, very important. And this, in a way, actually addresses the very important part of human animal conflict. If the villagers understand that there's an economic value attached to a tiger or another large animal for which tourism is increasing, they probably their tolerance for conflict increases. And that's why maintaining buffers becomes extremely important. Today, buffer zone tourism is probably as much or slightly increasing versus core tourism. There are no metrics in place to actually, you know, distinguish between them. Purely intuitively on the basis of itineraries that we design for our clients, we are almost 75-80% of our tickets or permits, safari permits, are in buffer areas for places like Tadoba. And that is the reason why we believe that buffer tourism is very, very important when it comes to tiger conservation. So I would like to close here by saying that something like a buffer, which was earlier outright rubbished, today is receiving and probably should receive far more consideration. There are reasons for that, as I may have summarized in the video. There are good sightings, you're supporting local community, you're getting better tourism opportunities because very high-end lodges are all over the buffer forests. Experiences increase because you can do activities like walks, sundowners, to an extent night drives, which are earlier allowed and may or may not be allowed now, but there is a chance. And when you put all this together, it gives a very credible safari experience to just going to the core and hoping to see animals. Believe me, core or buffer, sighting chances are the best in both. So if you've enjoyed this video, I would like you to comment. Do comment as to what your last safari was. Have you been to a buffer safari of any of the forests? And if you have you seen any interesting animals? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel. Till our next video, we really hope you like it. Take care. Have a great day.